underway. We're going to be showing a brief demonstration of how to make these pretty flowers using a vintage Daisy-Loom. So let's get right to it. So today I thought I'd show you something that I do with some of my leftover yarn. It's one of the most useless things so far that I make with leftover yarn. I don't know if you've ever seen one of these little devices, but it's actually made by CJ Bates. It's I think you can only buy them vintage. They might have newer ones available, but it's called a Daisy-Loom by CJ Bates, and it basically has this retractable component to this loom, and it makes various different kinds of daisies, or flowers, if you will. Anytime I have leftover colorful yarn, I usually try to pair it up with some of my darker yarn and make various different kinds. Now you can see there are a lot of different kinds of daisies you can make from it based on how you wind the yarn onto the loom. This one is kind of a more sparse with a very open center, and this is a little bit more closed in, and depending on how many times you wrap it, and you can get a thicker type of petal daisy out of it, and obviously whichever color you use, and also how you bind it off. And so we're going to go through a quick easy one, and we're going to create this particular daisy on the flower today. So since I have this leftover yarn, let me find the end. Here we go. I hold on to the Daisy-Loom by the knob on the bottom that turns and retracts, and I basically just loop it over the top of the circle, loop it around one of the pieces at the bottom, and go to the next one over, and just keep alternating, going to each one alternately. So I go one to the right, one to the left, one to the right, one to the left. And after I've done the first round, I can actually let that end piece loose and kind of tie it in when I do my last one. And I kind of try to snug it up a little bit so I can get a chance to see what it looks like. And then I just repeat that as many times as I want. To get the thickness of the flower that I want to end up with. Now, the difference is how many of these little loops that you miss, or that you alternate. So if I did every 2 prongs of the Daisy-Loom, it would give you this much more open flower that we were talking about before. This one's going to be a slightly thicker flower with a tightly closed loom. And now you can see I've come back to my originally starting point because my end of yarn is there. And prior to starting the winding on, I actually thread usually a darker yarn onto a weaving needle. I find the center of my daisy, and it doesn't have to be exact, and I push it into the center up through one of the, between the 2 prongs, between the 2 petals, if you will. And I pull the yarn through until I've got just about an inch of yarn left over. And then I kind of hold that down with my thumb, and going into the same center opening, I go to the next one, and I usually hold it upside down so that I don't grab onto one of the other prongs, and again I'm holding down the end of this sewn on yarn with my thumb so that I can kind of catch it after the first one or two. And so again, I go through the center of the hole, up through between two petals, pull that through, to the center, up to the next two petals. I am going to have to hold that down as it's getting shorter and shorter. And now you can kind of see that I'm starting to bind this together in the center. And again, I go through the center, up to the next two petals, and tighten it. And I make that pretty tight. Oops, see, I grabbed onto one of the prongs here, so I have to undo that and let that go. Trying to make sure you get underneath all the wound on yarn when you're going through this. Sometimes it goes above one of them, and it just leaves a little extra loop on top of the daisy, or on the bottom, depending on which side you're looking at. So the two optional or alternate ways that you can make daisies is how you wind the yarn onto the prongs. Since I went every prong, alternating as I went, if I had gone every other prong when I did that, and on the other side every other prong as well, it would have looked much more like this, with a much more open center. But also how I bind it off here, there's a couple ways you can do it as well. I'm going up through the petals, in between the prongs of the loop. Some people go through both the prongs, in the middle of the prongs, and in the middle of the petal itself, so they go up through there as they're going along. What I do is when I get to the end, and this is the last one through the prongs where I started, I could pop this off right now and it would be fine, but I actually like a little bit more definition in my petals. So what I do is I go back up through, and then I go up directly through parallel to the prong itself. And I do that for each of the prongs. So you see I go up through the center and then in between all those wound on yarns. And so it kind of separates those yarns a little bit, and you'll see that when I pop it off. And it's kind of an amazing thing when you pop this thing off. Now, most of this stuff is very tight. I like when you do this in a really firm way, it makes for a much more uniform daisy, if you will. Another way you could do this is, instead of going through every petal on the daisy, just go through every other petal on the daisy. That's actually what I did with this one, and so it's not quite as well defined as this one's going to be, so it'll be slightly different. This one I'm going through every petal, or parallel to every prong. It'll be a nice tighter inner center to the flower as well, since there's more density in the darker yarn that I'm putting up there through. There's more of it, right? One of these days, I plan on doing something with all these flowers that I'm making with leftover yarns. I will probably end up crocheting them together in some format. The original designs usually called for crocheting them together into an afghan. An afghan was one of the biggest things that you'd ever see. I can't imagine that I'll certainly have enough flowers to do an afghan. Okay, I went through in between every petal, and then I went inside every petal with the basting yarn. And so now I'm going to take my yarn and just thread it through the inside piece of this where it's very tight, so I can just kind of like tie off my yarn. And it doesn't require much because it's pretty tight in there. Since I like to try to make it as even as possible, I go through the entire ring of the center with my yarn, weaving in the yarn end. And it just gives it a little bit more uniformity, but it's really not that necessary. One of the things that's pleasant about these little flowers is that they're all individually unique. So now once I'm finished tying it off, we're ready to pop off the flower. So I snip off my yarn end, and I snip off these two yarn ends. And we may have to snip off a little bit more there. The scissors are a little bit too big for this. I'll wait until it's popped off. So then what you do is, using the knob on the back, you turn it counterclockwise, and you see those prongs start to pull in, and the flower pops off. And again, now that this is off, I can get a little bit closer to snipping off that yarn end. And get a beautiful little flower. Now you'll see that I have hundreds and hundreds of these flowers from the bowl, and I just keep them in a pretty colored bowl because I think it looks really nice. And eventually, like I said, I will do something with them, but for now they're just literally sitting around being colorful and decorative. So hopefully that was useful, and if you'd like to go out and try to find one of these vintage Daisy-Looms, they're made by C.J. Bates, and they actually sell them new in package or old in package. I forget what that expression is, but they're unused and new in package. They're just very old, and you can get them for under 20 bucks, even with shipping. And at least out on eBay, you can find them in the States. So good luck with that. And I'd love to hear about anybody else that has used one of these Daisy-Looms and what they've used it for and what they're using their flowers for as well. Thanks for joining me with Knitting with QueerJoe on this special Daisy-Loom presentation. We'll hopefully see you in the next one. And please feel free to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. That would be great. And I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks.